I'm 63 years old, and the best decision I ever made in my second marriage was a lie. Not a cruel lie, not even a big one, really. Just a quiet omission, a door I kept closed. And that closed door is the reason I'm sitting here today on the porch of my inn, watching the fog roll in off the Oregon coast, still the sole owner of everything I spent 27 years building from nothing. Let me tell you what almost happened instead. My name is June Alderman. That's not a name most people recognize, unless you've stayed at Alderman House on the northern Oregon coast, a 12-room inn perched on a bluff above Cannon Beach that I bought as a broken-down wreck in 1997 and rebuilt with my own hands, my own savings, and more stubbornness than any sensible person should have. I was 36 years old when I signed the deed. I had $11,000 in a savings account, a daughter who had just started kindergarten, and an ex-husband who told me I was making the worst mistake of my life. He wasn't wrong about many things, my ex-husband, but he was wrong about that. The property had been a fishing lodge that fell apart after the owner died, and his heirs couldn't agree on what to do with it. By the time I found it, the roof was rotting in two places. The plumbing was original to 1962, and the back deck had partially collapsed into the hillside. The realtor actually apologized when she showed it to me. She said, and I remember this clearly, I almost didn't call you about this one. I made an offer the same afternoon. I won't walk you through every hard year, because that would take longer than you have. But let me paint you a picture. For the first 3 years, I lived in the inn while I renovated it, my daughter sharing a room with me while I tore out walls on weekends and worked my job as an office manager for a dental practice during the week. I had a contractor friend, a woman named Bet, who charged me half her normal rate because she believed in what I was doing, helped me with the structural work. Everything else I learned from library books and YouTube tutorials and a lot of expensive mistakes. By 2003, Alderman House had 6 finished rooms and a reputation on the Oregon coast for the best breakfast on the bluff. By 2010, all 12 rooms were done, the deck was rebuilt, the garden was planted, and I had a wait list for summer weekends that ran 4 months out. By the time I turned 60, the property was appraised at $4.2 million. I had no mortgage. I owned it outright, every beam and shingle and sea glass window I'd installed myself. My daughter, Nora, had grown up in that inn. She'd done her homework at the front desk, helped me fold laundry on Sunday mornings, learned to make my grandmother's biscuit recipe so we could serve them to guests. She went to the University of Oregon for environmental science and came back to the coast afterward, not to work with me, but to work for a coastal conservation nonprofit 2 towns south. She had her own life, her own apartment, her own story. I was proud of her in the way you're proud of something you grew carefully and then let go. And I was lonely. I won't dress that up. Running an inn sounds social, and in some ways it is. You meet people constantly. Couples celebrating anniversaries, families on summer vacation, solo travelers who sit with you in the kitchen and tell you things they've never told anyone because they're passing through and will never see you again. I loved that part of the work. But the inn emptied out every night, and Nora was an hour south. And my closest friends had scattered the way friends do in your 50s to grandchildren and retirement communities and health problems that rearranged their priorities. I had Bet, who came for dinner every Thursday. I had my neighbor Hal, who was 82, and brought me tomatoes from his garden and asked me nothing complicated. But most evenings I sat on that porch alone with a glass of Willamette Valley Pinot and watched the water, and I thought, is this the rest of it? That was the state I was in when I met my husband at a historic preservation fundraiser in Astoria in the spring of my 61st year. His name was Gregory Holt. He was 68, recently retired from a career in commercial real estate development, recently widowed. He had silver hair and a straightforward handshake and a way of listening that made you feel like the only person in the room. He asked about Alderman House with what seemed like genuine interest, not the calculating interest I would later learn to recognize, but the warm curiosity of someone who appreciated old buildings. He said his late wife had always wanted to stay there. He said he'd driven past it a dozen times over the years and always meant to stop. He visited 2 weeks later. He stayed in the lighthouse room on a Tuesday night in April when the inn was quiet, and I brought him coffee on the front porch in the morning and we talked for 2 hours while the fog burned off. He came back the following month. By summer, we were seeing each other regularly. He was thoughtful in the specific ways that matter. He remembered small things I'd mentioned in passing, called when he said he would, showed up on a difficult day I'd had with a supplier with soup from a deli in Seaside because I'd mentioned once that I liked their soup. He seemed like someone who had been genuinely loved and knew how to love in return. I introduced him to Nora in August. She was polite but quiet afterward, which with Nora means she had thoughts she wasn't saying. I asked her directly on the phone that night. She paused longer than I liked. "He seems nice, Mom," she said. "I just want you to be careful." I told her she sounded like a worried parent instead of a daughter. She laughed, but not easily. Gregory proposed in October on the bluff behind the inn at sunset with a simple solitaire ring and a speech that made me cry. I said yes, I meant it. His 2 children flew in from California for a visit the following month. His son, the older one, was 44, worked in commercial lending in San Jose. His daughter was 40, a property manager based in Sacramento. They both seemed pleasant enough at dinner at the inn, which I closed to guests that weekend to host them, and they asked thoughtful questions about Cannon Beach and the history of the property and how I'd gotten into hospitality. It was the morning of their second day when the questions changed. I had stepped out to walk the garden, which I do every morning to check for storm damage, and just because I need those 15 minutes before the world starts. When I came back in, Gregory's son was standing in the front parlor with his phone out, photographing the fireplace mantel, the built-in bookshelves, the original fir floors. He startled when he saw me. "Sorry," he said, pocketing the phone quickly. "Just beautiful craftsmanship." I was documenting it for my own reference. "I'm in lending. We work with a lot of historic properties." I said something pleasant. I kept my face neutral, but something shifted in my chest, a quiet alarm that I couldn't quite name yet. Over breakfast, his daughter asked me how the inn was structured legally. "Just making conversation," she said, smiling. "My work is all property management, so I always think in terms of LLCs and liability structures. I hope you don't mind." I told her it was a sole proprietorship under my name, which was partially true and also none of her business. I deflected the rest and moved to refill the coffee. That evening, after they'd gone to bed, Gregory sat next to me on the porch and took my hand. "They love it here," he said. "They're just curious because they care about where we'll be living. They ask a lot of business questions for people who are just curious," I said. He squeezed my hand. "That's how they were raised. Their mother was the same way, very practical." I didn't say anything else, but I didn't stop thinking either. What I didn't tell Gregory and hadn't told him throughout our entire courtship was the complete picture of what I owned. I'd told him the inn was mine, obviously. You can't hide a 12-room inn on a bluff. But I'd let him believe the property was encumbered, that I had a small remaining mortgage, that the business ran on thinner margins than it did, that the whole operation was more modest than the reality. I'd been vague about the appraised value. I'd mentioned the work, the debt I'd carried in the early years, the lean seasons. I hadn't lied, exactly. I just never corrected his assumptions. Some instinct I'd developed over 27 years of running a business as a woman alone told me to wait, to watch, to keep that particular card face down on the table until I understood who was sitting across from me. The prenuptial agreement was my attorney's idea, and I was grateful. Her name was Karen Chu, and I'd worked with her since 2008, first on a zoning dispute with the county and later on several business contracts. When I told her I was getting married, the first thing she said was, "Good. When do you want to come in and draft the prenup?" Gregory had hesitated when I brought it up. Not dramatically, he didn't get angry or give me an ultimatum. But there was a flatness in his voice that lasted a few days, and when he finally agreed to sign, he said something I've thought about many times since. "I just hope you know this isn't how I see our marriage starting." I told him I hoped he understood it was how I needed it to start. He signed. The prenup was clear. Alderman house and all assets associated with it were my Snaffret property, the business, the land, the structure, all of it. Anything acquired together during the marriage could be considered joint, but what was mine going in would remain mine regardless of what happened. We married the following April. Small ceremony at the inn, 30 guests, Nora as my witness, a local officiant I'd known for years. Gregory's children stood beside him, all smiles. His daughter hugged me after and called me a wonderful addition to the family. Gregory cried a little during the vows, and I thought, this is real. This is a good man. I think I need you to understand that I did love him. Whatever came after, whatever I discovered, I want to be honest about that. For the first year and a half, I was happy in a way I hadn't been in a long time. But the second year, things began to move. Gregory's son started calling more often, not to chat, to discuss opportunities. He had a client, he said, who was interested in acquiring coastal hospitality properties. Had I ever considered a sale-leaseback structure where I sold the property but continued operating it? He could walk me through the numbers. It was actually a very smart financial move for someone in my position. I told him firmly and once that I had no interest in selling or restructuring, and that if he brought it up again, I would find it disrespectful. He didn't bring it up again directly, but his sister started showing up. She came twice that fall without much notice, claiming she was in the area for property management conferences. She walked through the inn on both visits with an appraiser's eyes, commenting on what updates I'd made, asking about seasonal occupancy rates, mentioning what comparable properties on the Oregon coast were selling for. On her second visit, she brought a friend, introduced casually as someone in hospitality finance, who asked me questions for 40 minutes at the kitchen table while I was trying to prep for a full house weekend. I answered nothing useful. I was polite. But afterward, I stood in my kitchen and felt something I hadn't felt in years. The specific cold anger of someone who built something real, watching people circle it like a valuation problem. The thing that broke it open was a FedEx envelope. It arrived on a Wednesday in February, addressed to Gregory, from a law firm in Sacramento I didn't recognize. Gregory wasn't home. He'd gone to Portland for a few days to visit an old colleague, and the envelopes sat on the hall table where I always put his mail. I wasn't going to open it. I am not a person who opens other people's mail. But that evening, I found it opened on the kitchen counter, and Gregory had left for his walk without mentioning it. I don't know what made me look. Maybe it was the Sacramento firm. Maybe it was the feeling that had been building for months like pressure in the air before a storm. I looked. It was a draft of something called a spousal property agreement. The language was dense, but I've read enough legal documents in my business life to understand the structure. It was a document that, if signed by both parties, would reclassify certain assets currently held in my name as marital property subject to equitable division, including, in the appendix, a property described as the Coastal Inn and associated real estate, currently titled to June Alderman Holt, located in Cannon Beach, Oregon. I put the document back exactly as I'd found it. I poured myself a glass of water. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then I called Karen. She told me to say nothing to Gregory yet. She told me to photograph every page of the document with my phone before he came home. She told me to come see her the following morning. I did all three. At Karen's office, she went through it carefully. She said what concerned her most wasn't just the document itself, but the fact that it had been drafted at all, and that Gregory clearly hadn't mentioned it to me. The prenup made most of this moot, she said. The document would be nearly impossible to enforce given what we had in place. But the fact that someone had paid a Sacramento attorney to draft it was worth understanding. She asked me if Gregory had a history she should know about. I said I didn't know enough to answer that question. She said she could help me find out. I hired an investigator the next week. A woman named Terry, based in Portland, who had been recommended to me by a friend going through a difficult divorce. I asked Terry to look at Gregory's financial history, his late wife's estate, and anything involving his children's professional records. It took her 3 weeks. When she came back, she sat across from me in the same kitchen, where I'd found that FedEx envelope and laid out a file that made my hands go cold. Gregory's late wife, Vivian, had died 18 months before I met him. She had been a retired school principal with a modest estate, their house in Marin County, a retirement account, some savings. In the year before her death, she had been diagnosed with early-stage vascular dementia. In the 8 months before she died, she had transferred the Marin house into Gregory's name alone and consolidated her retirement accounts into a joint account that became solely his upon her death. Her sister had contested the transfers. She said Vivian had told her she felt pressured to sign things she didn't fully understand. The sister consulted an attorney, but was told the documents appeared to be properly executed. The case went nowhere. Gregory inherited everything and sold the Marin house 11 months later for just under $2 million. His son had been sued by a former business partner in 2019 for fraudulent misrepresentation in a lending deal. The case settled confidentially. His daughter had been the subject of a property management complaint filed with the California Department of Real Estate in 2021, involving allegations of unauthorized financial transactions on behalf of elderly property owners. The complaint had been resolved. The file Terry got was partial, but her license had been placed on probationary status for 14 months. I sat with that file for a long time. Then I called Nora. I drove down to her apartment in Lincoln City that Saturday and spread everything on her kitchen table. She read through it in silence, and when she finished, she looked up at me with an expression I recognized from her childhood, the one she got when something frightened her and she was trying not to show it. "Mom," she said, "how much does he think the inn is worth?" I told her what I suspected, probably somewhere close to the real number. His children had been thorough in their assessments. And the prenup holds. Karen is certain of that. But this document he had drafted was an attempt to undo the prenup. Yes. Nora pressed her hands flat on the table. "What are you going to do?" I told her I wasn't just going to leave quietly. I told her what I'd told myself in that kitchen in February, sitting with that water glass, looking at my reflection in the window over the sink. I had built Alderman house from a rotting hull. I had done it alone, in my 30s, with a daughter in kindergarten and $11,000. Nobody was going to maneuver me out of it with a document from a Sacramento law firm while I was too in love to notice. "I'm going to finish it properly," I said. "All of them." Karen spent the next 6 weeks building the case. We worked with a forensic financial consultant who documented the attempt to reclassify the inn as marital property. We obtained records of Gregory's communications with his children through a process I'll let Karen explain if anyone ever asks her, because I'm still not entirely clear on how she got them. What those records showed was a coordinated strategy, emails between Gregory and his son discussing how to structure the asset situation before I had time to lawer it up further. Messages from his daughter describing the inn's likely sale value in detail and suggesting specific timing for the property agreement to be presented to me, a thread between all three of them about a property attorney they'd consulted in Portland. There was also a message from Gregory to his son, sent 4 days after we got engaged, that I have not been able to get fully out of my mind. He wrote, "She's trusting. That's the main thing." I reached out to Vivian's sister through a mutual acquaintance. Her name was Peggy, and when she heard my name and why I was calling, she started crying before I'd finished my second sentence. She said she'd spent 2 years trying to tell anyone who would listen what had happened to Vivian, and no one had. I asked if she'd be willing to come to Oregon. She said she'd get in the car that afternoon. I planned the confrontation for a Saturday evening in late April, almost exactly 1 year after our wedding. I told Gregory I wanted to have a small dinner at the inn to mark our anniversary, a private evening, just family. He was pleased. He said it was a wonderful idea. What I told him was family arrived in stages. Karen came first and positioned herself in the front parlor. Terry arrived next. Nora came with her boyfriend, who had no idea what was happening and spent the evening looking understandably confused. Gregory's son and daughter arrived together, dressed up, carrying wine. Then Peggy walked through the front door. Gregory saw her from across the room and went still. "Gregory," I said from where I was standing near the fireplace, "you remember Vivian's sister?" His son started to stand up. I held up one hand. "The Clatsop County Sheriff's Office has 2 detectives parked at the bottom of the drive," I said. "Karen, would you like to explain what that means?" Karen stepped forward and explained, in the clearest terms, what we had found. The drafted property agreement, the communications, Gregory's history with Vivian, his children's professional violations, the coordinated strategy to reclassify Alderman House as marital property and position it for a forced sale or buyout. Gregory's daughter started to cry. His son said nothing. He stared at the table. Gregory looked at me for a long moment. He said, "Catherine, I do love you." I had told him on our first date that my middle name was Catherine, that my mother had called me that when I was small, and that I had always liked it better than June. It was the kind of detail that, coming from him in that moment, was meant to reach me. "You loved what you thought you were getting," I said. "You never really looked at what was actually here." I walked to the front door and opened it. The detectives came up the drive. Gregory was charged with attempted financial fraud and elder financial abuse. His son was charged with conspiracy. His daughter faced additional complaint referrals to the California DRE on top of the existing probationary record. Gregory's son pled no contest and received 2 years probation and mandatory financial crime counseling. His daughter lost her real estate license permanently. Gregory went to trial and was convicted on both counts. He was sentenced to 4 years at 68 years old. With his health history and the conditions of the facility, his attorney told the court it was effectively a longer sentence than it appeared. The divorce was finalized 4 months after the arrest. The prenup held completely. Gregory left with nothing that had been mine. His legal costs, by the time the trial was over, had consumed most of what he'd kept from Vivian's estate. Peggy testified at the trial. She was on the stand for almost 2 hours, and afterward she sat with me on the porch of the inn, and I poured her a glass of the Pinot I keep for evenings that mean something, and we didn't talk for a while, just watched the water. "She would have liked you," Peggy said eventually. "Vivian. She was stubborn too. I told her I'd take that. Nora comes to the inn most weekends now. She's been talking about whether there might be a role for her here, eventually, some integration between her conservation work and what we do at the property. I told her the door is always open. I meant that in every sense. Bet still comes for Thursday dinners. Hal still brings tomatoes. The lighthouse room is booked through October. I still walk the garden every morning before the world starts. I still sit on this porch in the evenings with the Pinot and watch the fog move in from the Pacific. I'm 63 years old and I own every inch of this bluff, every room in this house, every repair I've made, and every season I've weathered. I'm going to tell you the same thing I now tell every woman who sits across from me at that kitchen table and asks me, as guests sometimes do after a glass or 2 of wine, whether I have any regrets about how my second marriage went. I tell them, know what you have, know its real value, not just its dollar value. Know that love and financial vulnerability can exist in the same moment in your life, and that recognizing one doesn't mean surrendering to the other. Keep the documents current, keep an attorney you trust, and understand that protecting yourself is not the opposite of loving someone. Sometimes it's what makes it possible to love them clearly enough to see exactly who they are. I didn't tell Gregory the full truth about what I owned, and I have made my peace with that. What I kept private gave me the time I needed to see what I was really dealing with. By the time they came for Alderman House, I was ready. They thought they were walking into a transaction. They walked into a reckoning, and I'm still here, on my bluff, in my inn, watching my ocean, on my terms. That's the only ending that was ever acceptable to me.